I'm Cassandra Aaron Johnson, and I built my life on quiet work, double shifts up front, service to my country behind the scenes. For years, I covered bills, drove my dad to appointments, babysat my niece, and kept the peace. But when my family tried to rope me into a false alibi and laughed in court, "She's just a waiter," I chose the truth, and everything changed. Ever been dismissed or betrayed by the people you showed up for? Tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I dive in, drop your city below. And if you've ever had to stand your ground after being wronged, hit like and subscribe for more real stories about boundaries and self-respect. What happened next might surprise you. I grew up believing that work meant worth, and worth meant staying quiet about what you did as long as you did it well. My family operated on simple math: time plus sweat equals value, and the loudest voice got the most credit. I learned early to keep my head down and my hands busy. My father ran a small auto repair shop on the South Side, the kind of place where men gathered to solve the world's problems over coffee that had been sitting too long. He'd inherited the business from his father, along with the belief that respect came from what people could see: the cars you drove, the tools you owned, the stories you told. I was the middle child between my older brother Danny and my younger sister Lisa, and somehow I became the one who filled the gaps nobody else wanted to handle. When Dad needed rides to medical appointments after his back surgery, I rearranged my schedule. When Danny's rent came up short, I covered it without asking questions. When Lisa needed someone to watch her daughter Megan so she could pick up extra shifts at the hospital, I showed up with coloring books and patience. They called me reliable, which in my family was code for available. The restaurant job started as legitimate cover, nothing more. Mario's Italian Kitchen on Harbor Boulevard, the kind of place that served decent food to people who worked for a living. I picked up shifts when I could, learned to balance plates up my arm and smile through the rush. The owner, Tony, was former Army and asked few questions about my schedule. When I needed 3 weeks off for training, I told him it was family business. When I came back with a slight limp from a training injury, I said I'd twisted my ankle hiking. He nodded and put me back on the rotation. My family saw the apron and the late nights and drew their own conclusions. I was their daughter who poured coffee and cleared tables, who came home smelling like garlic and counting small bills. They knew I worked hard because that's what our family did, but they never thought to ask what else I might be working toward. I didn't correct them because the truth was compartmentalized, classified, and, honestly, easier to keep separate. The money I brought home from my actual career, the steady paycheck, the benefits, the occasional bonus, got folded into the family's assumptions about tip money and overtime. When I helped with Dad's mortgage payment, they figured I'd had a good month. When I bought Lisa's daughter new school clothes, they assumed I was just being generous with my cash tips. Nobody asked how a waitress afforded to be so consistently generous, and I didn't volunteer the information. I gave them time, money, and silence about my real life, which somehow became proof that I had nowhere more important to be. The narrative they built around me was simple. I was the family member who hadn't quite figured out her path, who was still slinging plates while everyone else had moved on to real careers. Danny managed inventory at a warehouse and talked about his plans to start his own distribution business. Lisa had her nursing degree and worked in pediatrics. I was just their sister who worked in food service and could be counted on to show up when needed. The first time someone called me a lifer in front of the family, I let it slide. We were at Danny's apartment for his birthday, and one of his friends was holding court about career advancement and 5-year plans. "What about you, Cassandra?" he asked, turning to me with the kind of smile that already knew the answer. "Still at the restaurant?" "Still working," I said, which was true enough. Danny laughed and opened another beer. "Cassandra's our career waitress. She's got job security anyway. People always need to eat, right?" The room chuckled, and I nodded along because it was easier than explaining that I'd just finished a rotation that most people couldn't spell, let alone understand. I was good at blending in, trained to observe without drawing attention, and my family's assumptions provided perfect camouflage for a life they never thought to question. Dad started having his friends over more often after his surgery, men from the neighborhood who measured success in visible terms. They gathered around his workbench on Saturday afternoons, drinking beer and solving problems they'd never actually face. They talked about military strategy without having served, about business deals they'd never made, about respect they thought they'd earned. When I brought them sandwiches or cleaned up their empty bottles, they'd nod at me like I was part of the furniture. "Good kid," I heard one of them tell Dad. "Doesn't give you any trouble, just does her job." Dad agreed, and I realized that in his mind, my job was taking care of things quietly so he could focus on what mattered to him. I was useful background, the daughter who made things easier without requiring much attention or investment in return. It was a role I'd fallen into gradually, and by the time I recognized it, it felt too late to renegotiate. When I missed family events, because I was deployed though they didn't know that's what I was calling my absences, they marked it as selfishness. When I came back with a deeper tan and new scars I couldn't explain, they didn't ask questions. When I paid Danny's rent again because he'd spent his paycheck on a motorcycle down payment, they took it as confirmation that I had nothing better to do with my money. The pattern became predictable. They needed something, I provided it, and my quiet competence became evidence of my limited ambitions. I was the safety net that let them take risks, the financial cushion that let them make poor decisions, the reliable presence that let them assume tomorrow would look like today. And because I couldn't explain what I really did or why my schedule was actually more complicated than theirs, I let them build their story around what they could see. Looking back, I understand that I chose silence over conflict, privacy over recognition. I thought I was protecting something important by keeping my two worlds separate. What I didn't anticipate was how that separation would eventually become a weapon they'd use against me, or how their casual dismissal would echo in a courtroom when the stakes got real and staying quiet was no longer an option. The jokes started small, the way most cruelty does. Nothing you could call them on directly, just comments that landed like paper cuts and accumulated over time. "Still slinging plates" became Danny's standard greeting. "When are you getting a real job?" was Dad's contribution to every family dinner. I learned to smile and change the subject, but the message was clear. My work didn't count. Dad's social circle had expanded after his recovery, and the new faces brought new energy to the garage. These weren't the old-timers who'd known him for decades and respected his skills with an engine. These were men who measured worth in flashier terms: the kind of cars they drove, the expensive tools they owned, the stories they could tell about deals they'd made and people they'd impressed. In this crowd, my quiet competence didn't register. Frank Calderon became Dad's closest friend in this group, a man who'd made money in construction and wasn't shy about displaying it. He drove a new truck every 2 years, wore designer work boots that had never seen actual construction sites, and spoke about business opportunities with the confidence of someone who'd forgotten what it felt like to worry about rent. When he looked at me, I could see him doing the math. Waitress equals unsuccessful, unsuccessful equals unimportant. "Your daughter's sweet," he told Dad one Saturday afternoon while I was cleaning up their lunch mess. "Nice to see a kid who knows her place, you know? No attitude, just does what needs doing." Dad nodded like this was a compliment we should all appreciate. I kept wiping down the workbench and said nothing because what was I going to say? That I'd spent the previous month in training exercises that would have impressed him more than his truck? That my place was somewhere he'd never be qualified to understand? The compartmentalization that protected my real career also meant I had to absorb these casual dismissals without defending myself. The comments escalated when I missed Lisa's birthday party because I was out of state for what I called a work conference. I'd actually been in Virginia for specialized training that I couldn't reschedule and couldn't explain, but my family saw it as choosing my waitressing job over family obligations. "She's getting too big for her britches," I heard Dad tell someone on the phone later that week. "Thinks her little restaurant job is more important than family." Danny was more direct. "What kind of waitress has conferences anyway? It's not like you're running the place." I tried to explain that sometimes work required travel, that not all opportunities could be rescheduled around birthdays, but my explanations sounded thin even to me. How could I make them understand that some commitments were non-negotiable when I couldn't tell them what those commitments actually were? The dynamic shifted after that missed party. Where I'd once been the reliable one, now I was getting too big for my britches. Where my financial help had been appreciated, now it came with commentary about how I was probably overcompensating for missing important events. My brother started making jokes about my career ambitions whenever I had to leave town for work. My sister began asking pointed questions about why a restaurant would need me to travel so much. Maybe she's got a side hustle, Danny suggested during one family dinner, grinning like he'd made a clever observation. What do you think, Cassandra? Selling something we don't know about? The table laughed, and I forced myself to laugh along, because the alternative was explaining that my side hustle was national defense, and I'd taken an oath not to discuss it casually over meatloaf. The irony wasn't lost on me that the very discretion my actual job required was being interpreted as evidence that I thought I was better than my family. When I covered Dad's mortgage payment after his insurance had a processing delay, he accepted the money but complained that I'd made him feel small by having it available so readily. Must be nice to have that kind of cash lying around from serving pasta, he said, and there was an edge to it that hadn't been there before. Frank Calderon was there that day, and he chimed in with his own analysis. Kids these days think money grows on trees. Probably doesn't even know what it feels like to really work for something. I stood in Dad's kitchen, holding the receipt for a mortgage payment that would keep him in his house, listening to him agree that I didn't understand real work. The man whose medical appointments I'd driven him to, whose bills I'd helped cover, whose friends I'd fed and cleaned up after, was nodding along with the assessment that I'd had things too easy. That night, I sat in my apartment and tried to understand how helping had become evidence of my inadequacy, how reliability had transformed into proof that I wasn't ambitious enough, how my quiet competence had been reframed as a sign that I didn't understand the real world. I'd thought I was being generous and supportive. They'd decided I was naive and limited. The worst part was the creeping doubt. When people you care about consistently tell you that your contributions don't matter, that your work isn't real, that you're not living up to your potential, part of you starts to wonder if they're right. I found myself questioning decisions I'd been confident about, second-guessing instincts that had served me well in actual high-stakes situations. If the people who knew me best thought I was wasting my life, maybe they saw something I couldn't. But then I'd report for duty and remember what real standards looked like, what actual accountability felt like, what it meant to be trusted with something that mattered. The contrast became sharper each time. With my family, I was the disappointing daughter who poured coffee for a living. At work, I was someone whose judgment could make the difference between mission success and mission failure. The gap between those two identities was getting harder to bridge. The fight at Dad's garage started over something small, a customer complaint about a billing error that escalated when Frank Calderon got involved. What should have been a simple refund became a shouting match, then a threat, then a moment when Frank's hand moved to his waistband and everyone in the room went quiet. The customer left without another word, and I thought that was the end of it. But the customer turned out to be the kind of man who knew people, who made phone calls, who didn't let threats slide. Within 2 weeks, investigators were asking questions about the garage's business practices, looking at records, talking to suppliers. What they found was a pattern of selling used parts as new, unregistered cash sales, and inventory that didn't match the paperwork. Dad had been cutting corners for years, and Frank had been encouraging him to cut deeper. When the charges came, they included fraud, tax evasion, and weapons violations from that moment when Frank had shown a gun to end an argument. Dad was named as a co-conspirator, along with 2 other men from his circle who'd been involved in the parts scheme. Frank was the primary defendant, but everyone connected to the operation faced serious jail time. That's when they decided they needed my help. You were at work that day, Danny told me during a family meeting at Dad's kitchen table. All day. You can say we were all there with you, helping with inventory or something. Lisa nodded earnestly. It's not really lying. You were working, and we do help out at the garage sometimes. It's just being specific about timing. Dad sat quiet while his children planned his alibi, but when I didn't immediately agree, he looked up. I need you on this one, Cassandra. Family backs family. I understood what they were asking. The assault happened on a Thursday afternoon when I'd actually been 3 states away for a briefing I couldn't discuss. They wanted me to provide cover for a story that would place all of them at a restaurant where I worked, during hours when I could testify they'd been helping me with some fabricated inventory project. Simple, clean, and completely false. I can't do that, I said. Frank Calderon, who'd been sitting in Dad's living room during this kitchen conversation, chose that moment to join us. Can't or won't? He asked, leaning against the door frame with the casual confidence of a man who'd never doubted his own importance. Both, I said. Danny laughed, but it wasn't friendly. Come on, Cassandra. It's not like you're busy saving the world over there. You're slinging pasta. This is your family. The contempt in his voice was clear. To him, I was asking them to take serious legal consequences so I could maintain some imaginary moral high ground about a job he'd never respected. He couldn't understand why their sister the waitress would prioritize abstract principles over concrete loyalty. Dad tried a different approach. Look, we're not asking you to lie about anything important. Just confirm we were together that day. That's something you'd remember, right? Your family coming by your work. But I would remember, and that was the problem. I remembered exactly where I'd been that Thursday, exactly why I couldn't have been serving dinner in Harbor Boulevard, exactly what briefing I'd attended instead. I also remembered the oath I'd taken, the clearance I maintained, and the career that depended on my ability to tell the truth under pressure. I won't testify to something that didn't happen, I said. The kitchen went quiet. Lisa looked confused, like she couldn't understand why this was complicated. Danny looked angry, like I was choosing strangers over blood. Dad looked disappointed, like I'd confirmed something he'd suspected about my character. Frank stepped fully into the kitchen and pulled out a chair. Maybe we need to think about this differently, he said, settling himself at the table like he was mediating a business dispute. Cassandra, you understand what happens to your dad if this goes badly, right? You understand what it means for the family. I understood perfectly. I also understood what would happen to me if I committed perjury in federal court, what it would mean for my clearance, my career, my ability to serve. But I couldn't explain that calculation without revealing the very thing I'd kept secret from them. I understand the situation, I said. But I can't help the way you want me to help. That's when the real contempt came out. Danny shook his head and muttered something about always knowing I thought I was better than the rest of them. Lisa said I was being selfish, that family meant sacrifice. Dad just looked tired, like I'd confirmed his worst fears about who I really was. Frank leaned back in his chair and smiled, but there was nothing warm about it. Well, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, I guess we know where Cassandra's loyalties really lie. Good to find out now. 3 days later, I was sitting in the gallery of the federal courthouse, watching my family prepare for trial while they prepared to watch me disappoint them one final time. Danny had positioned himself where I could see his disapproving expression. Lisa kept glancing over with hurt confusion. Dad stared straight ahead like I wasn't there. When someone behind me whispered, "She's just a waitress anyway," I knew they were talking about me. When several people laughed quietly, I knew they all agreed. I was the family member who'd chosen her meaningless job over her blood relatives, who'd proven that she didn't understand what really mattered. Frank's lawyer had prepared his defense around character witnesses and family support, the kind of strategy that relied on showing the defendant as a good man who'd made a mistake rather than a career criminal who'd been caught. My refusal to participate had damaged that narrative, and everyone in the gallery understood that I was the weak link who'd failed to hold. But I'd also contacted the prosecutor's office, and I'd explained exactly what I could lawfully testify to if called. The meeting had been brief, professional, and conducted with the kind of discretion that would protect both my security clearance and the integrity of the case. They knew what I did, even if my family didn't. When the judge called the court to order, I watched my brother lean over to Frank and whisper something that made them both smirk. When the prosecutor stood to call his first witness, Danny actually turned around to look at me with the kind of pity you'd reserve for someone who'd just made a very stupid mistake. That's when the prosecutor said, "Your Honor, the state calls Captain Cassandra." The silence that followed wasn't immediate. It took a moment for the words to register, for the title to connect with the woman sitting in the gallery, whom everyone thought they knew. I watched comprehension dawn on faces I'd known my entire life, watched confusion replace contempt, watched the simple story they'd built around me crumble in real time. Danny's head snapped around so fast I heard his neck crack. Lisa's mouth actually fell open. Dad finally looked at me directly for the first time in weeks, and the expression on his face was something I'd never seen before: recognition mixed with disbelief, like he was seeing a stranger wearing his daughter's appearance. Frank Calderon had gone completely still in his chair, the casual arrogance he'd worn throughout the proceedings replaced by the focused attention of a man who'd just realized he'd miscalculated something important. His lawyer was frantically flipping through paperwork, looking for information that wasn't there because we'd been careful about disclosure timing. I stood and walked to the witness stand with the same steady pace I'd used for years of family dinners and holiday gatherings, the same unremarkable presence that had let them assume I was exactly what I appeared to be. The bailiff approached with the oath, and I raised my right hand with muscle memory that predated every casual dismissal they'd offered about my lack of ambition. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "I do," I said, and meant it the same way I'd meant it when I'd taken my commission, when I'd accepted my clearance, when I'd committed to something larger than family convenience. The prosecutor approached with respectful professionalism, the tone you use when addressing someone whose credentials speak for themselves. "Captain, please state your full name and occupation for the record." "Captain Cassandra Aaron Johnson, United States Navy SEALs," I said, and the words carried across the courtroom like a stone dropping into still water. Danny made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Lisa put her hand over her mouth. Dad had gone completely rigid, staring at me like I was a puzzle he'd been trying to solve his entire life and had just been handed the missing pieces. The prosecutor continued with the preliminary questions: length of service, current assignment, security clearance level, building a foundation that transformed their disappointing sister into someone whose testimony carried federal authority. Each answer was crisp, professional, and completely at odds with every assumption they'd made about my capabilities. "Captain Johnson, were you present at the defendant's place of business on the afternoon in question?" "No, I was not." "Can you tell the court where you were?" "I was attending a classified briefing at Naval Special Warfare Group 2 headquarters in Virginia Beach." "Can this be verified independently?" "Yes, through official travel records and attendance logs." The questions were straightforward, designed to establish timeline and location rather than operational details. The prosecutor had been careful to request only information I could provide without compromising security, and my answers were factual without being comprehensive. But every response reinforced the same basic truth: I was exactly where I said I was, doing exactly what I said I was doing, and the story Frank's defense team had planned around my expected testimony was built on false assumptions. During cross-examination, Frank's lawyer tried to suggest that my military service was somehow irrelevant to the question of family loyalty, that a daughter should support her father regardless of legal technicalities. It was the wrong approach to take with someone who'd sworn multiple oaths to prioritize truth over convenience. "Captain Johnson, you understand that your testimony may result in serious consequences for your family members?" "I understand that my testimony is truthful and complete. But surely family relationships create certain obligations that transcend strict legal requirements?" "My obligation is to tell the truth under oath. That obligation is absolute." I could feel my family's eyes on me throughout the questioning, could sense their growing understanding that the person they thought they'd known was someone else entirely. Danny kept shaking his head like he was trying to wake up from a confusing dream. Lisa had tears in her eyes, though I couldn't tell if they were from grief or shock or some combination of both. Dad hadn't looked away from me since I'd taken the stand, and his expression had shifted from disbelief to something that looked almost like recognition. Not of who I was now, but of moments from the past that suddenly made sense in a different context: the unexplained absences, the steady income, the physical conditioning I'd maintained without gym memberships they could account for. When the prosecutor finished his questions, I was dismissed with the same professional courtesy I'd received throughout. I walked back to the gallery knowing that whatever relationship I'd had with my family before this moment was over, and whatever came next would have to be built on an entirely different foundation. Frank was convicted on all counts. Dad pleaded to lesser charges in exchange for cooperation, avoiding jail time but accepting probation and financial penalties that would change his life significantly. The garage closed permanently, and the social circle that had formed around it dissolved as quickly as it had appeared. I sat through the sentencing hearing 2 months later, listening to the judge talk about consequences and accountability, while my family sat 3 rows behind me. When it was over, I walked out of the courthouse alone, not because I was angry or hurt, but because I understood that the person they'd thought they were supporting, dismissing, and ultimately judging had never actually existed. The woman who'd served their dinner and cleaned up their messes, who'd covered their bills and absorbed their casual contempt, had been a character I'd played so well that I'd sometimes forgotten it was a performance. The real question now was whether any relationship could survive the gap between who they'd thought I was and who I'd always been. The weeks after the trial passed in a strange quiet. My phone, which had buzzed constantly with family group chats and dinner plans and requests for rides or loans, went essentially silent. When messages did come, they carried a different weight, entirely careful, formal communications that read like correspondence with a distant acquaintance rather than exchanges between relatives. Danny texted first, 3 days after sentencing, "Can we talk?" I replied that I was available, and he called that evening with the kind of nervous energy I remembered from childhood, when he'd broken something valuable and was trying to figure out how much trouble he was in. "I don't understand why you didn't tell us," he said without preamble. "About what, specifically?" "About who you are. About what you do. About any of it." I thought about how to answer that, how to explain compartmentalization to someone who'd never needed to separate different aspects of his life for security reasons. It wasn't something I could discuss casually. "But we're family. We should have known." The hurt in his voice was genuine, and I recognized the confusion behind it. In his mind, family meant complete transparency, meant sharing everything regardless of external requirements or professional obligations. He couldn't understand why I'd kept such a fundamental part of my identity separate from my relationships with them. "Some things can't be shared just because we're related," I said. "Some information has restrictions that don't make exceptions for family." "But you let us think you were just—" He stopped himself before finishing the sentence, but we both knew what came next. "I let you think what you were going to think anyway. I never lied about what I did. I just didn't correct your assumptions." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, circling around the same basic question. Why had I allowed them to build their understanding of me on incomplete information? Danny couldn't grasp that some jobs require silence not as a personal choice, but as a professional necessity, that certain careers exist in spaces where casual disclosure isn't an option. Lisa's call came a week later, and her approach was different, more emotional, more focused on the feelings involved than the facts. She'd been crying, and her voice carried the shaky quality of someone who'd been thinking about something painful for a long time. "I keep remembering things," she said. "Like when you missed my birthday but paid for Megan's daycare for a whole month afterward. Or when you came back from that hiking trip with that scar on your shoulder and said you'd fallen on some rocks. I couldn't talk about where I'd actually been. But I made fun of you for being clumsy. I actually teased you about not knowing how to hike properly, and you just stood there and let me." The memory was sharp. Lisa laughing about my supposed incompetence while I stood in her kitchen, still processing a mission that had gone sideways and resulted in injuries I couldn't explain. I'd absorbed her gentle mockery because the alternative was violating operational security, and I'd thought that was a reasonable trade. "I was protecting information that needed to be protected," I said. "But you weren't protecting yourself. You let us think you were this person who wasn't going anywhere, who didn't have anything important going on. You let us treat you like you were less than you are." That was the core of it, and it was harder to answer. I had let them diminish me because keeping the peace felt more important than defending myself with information I couldn't share. I'd accepted their casual dismissal because correcting it would have required revealing things that were classified, compartmentalized, and honestly easier to keep separate from family dynamics. "I thought it was better to keep different parts of my life in different places," I said. "But what about us? What about what we missed out on by not knowing who you really are?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself. By maintaining operational security around my career, I'd also deprived my family of the chance to know and respect the person I actually was. They'd built their relationship with a version of me that was real but incomplete, and when the complete picture emerged, it retroactively changed every interaction we'd ever had. The hardest conversation came 6 weeks later when Dad finally called. His voice sounded older, flattened by legal stress and the collapse of the social world he'd built around Frank and the garage. He'd been dealing with probation requirements, financial penalties, and the kind of scrutiny that came with being a convicted felon, even one who'd avoided jail time. "I owe you an apology," he said without preliminary small talk. "For what?" "For not knowing. For not asking. For letting other people talk about my own daughter like they knew better than I did." I waited, because there was clearly more he needed to say. "I keep thinking about Frank, about the way he'd talk about you. About work ethic and knowing your place and all that garbage." And I just sat there and nodded like he was making sense. "You believed what you could see. But I should have seen more. I should have asked better questions. I should have known that you wouldn't be helping us all these years if you didn't have something solid going on." The conversation lasted over an hour, and by the end of it, we'd established some basic parameters for moving forward. Dad wanted to rebuild our relationship on more honest ground, but he understood that trust would have to be earned rather than assumed. I was willing to try, but with clear boundaries about what kinds of support I could offer and what kinds of behavior I would accept. "I don't want you to think I'm proud of what happened," he said before we hung up. "With Frank, with the business, with any of it. I made poor choices, and they had consequences for people I care about." "I know," I said, and I meant it. "But I am proud of you. I should have said that years ago, and I should have said it whether I understood what you were doing or not." 6 months after the trial, I was settling into a routine that felt sustainable for the first time in years. Work remained work demanding, classified, and separate from my personal life by necessity. The restaurant shifts had ended when Tony sold Mario's to a chain that wanted younger staff and flashier service, but I'd found another part-time position at a coffee shop near the base that appreciated reliability and asked few questions about my schedule. My apartment felt different now that it wasn't serving as a staging area for family emergencies. The phone didn't ring at odd hours with requests for rides or loans or babysitting. The quiet that had initially felt strange now felt like space I could fill with my own priorities: reading I'd been putting off, maintenance projects I'd been deferring, sleep schedules that aligned with my actual workload rather than other people's crises. The family situation had stabilized into something I could work with. Dad and I met for coffee once a month, usually at a place halfway between his apartment and mine, conversations that stayed focused on safe topics like his physical therapy progress and my visible hobbies. He was making an effort to ask questions that showed interest without pushing for information I couldn't share, and I was learning to appreciate the intention behind his awkward attempts at connection. Danny had moved to Phoenix for a fresh start, taking a job with a logistics company that didn't mind his association with Dad's legal troubles. We texted occasionally, brief exchanges that felt more like acquaintances staying in touch than siblings maintaining a relationship. The geographic distance seemed to help both of us process the changes without the pressure of immediate reconciliation. Lisa had been more persistent about rebuilding, but also more willing to accept boundaries when I established them. She learned to ask about my work in general terms and to respect non-answers when questions got too specific. When her daughter Megan asked why Aunt Cassandra couldn't talk about her job, Lisa had explained that some grown-ups have work that needs to stay private, which was probably the most accurate description any family member had ever offered. The biggest adjustment had been learning to live without the constant sense of responsibility for other people's problems. For years, I'd been the family member who could be counted on to cover shortfalls, provide emergency transportation, and generally function as a backup plan when other arrangements fell through. Stepping back from that role had left a gap that everyone had to figure out how to fill independently. Frank Calderon had been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, and his absence from Dad's life had been more significant than anyone expected. Without Frank's influence, Dad had begun making different choices about friends and activities, gravitating toward people who were dealing with their own recovery rather than those who encouraged risk-taking. His new social circle consisted mainly of other men in similar legal situations, people who understood the value of staying out of trouble. I'd started working with a counselor who specialized in military families, someone who understood the complexity of maintaining civilian relationships while serving in roles that required operational security. The sessions had helped me understand that my choice to compartmentalize hadn't been wrong, but that I'd carried the isolation further than necessary and absorbed more dismissive treatment than I'd needed to accept. "You protected the mission," she'd told me during one session. "But you didn't protect yourself." That observation had been particularly helpful when Dad made his first attempt at a serious apology. We'd been meeting for coffee for 3 months when he finally addressed what had happened in Frank's presence, the comments he'd agreed with, the assumptions he'd let stand unchallenged. "I let him talk about you like you were less than you are," Dad said, staring into his coffee cup instead of meeting my eyes. "I let him make you small because it was easier than defending something I didn't understand. You couldn't defend what you didn't know about. But I could have defended you as a person. I could have said that you were valuable regardless of what job you had. I could have told him to shut up when he got disrespectful." That conversation had marked a turning point in our monthly meetings. Dad had begun asking questions that showed he was trying to understand me as an individual rather than as a family function. He'd started sharing information about his own struggles with rebuilding his life after the legal consequences, treating me more like a confidant than a resource. The strangest part of the whole experience had been discovering that I actually liked my family better in smaller doses. When I wasn't responsible for managing their crises or absorbing their casual dismissals, when our interactions were chosen rather than obligated, I could appreciate Dad's dry humor and Lisa's genuine warmth. Danny remained more complicated, but even those exchanges had improved now that they weren't built around his assumptions about my limitations. My work colleagues had noticed the change, though they hadn't asked direct questions about what had shifted in my personal life. I was sleeping better, performing more consistently, and generally seemed less divided between competing priorities. My commanding officer had mentioned during a routine evaluation that I seemed more focused, more present, and more committed to long-term planning. "Everything stable on the home front?" he'd asked, and I'd been able to answer honestly that yes, things were stable, probably for the first time in years. A year after the trial, Dad asked if we could meet somewhere other than our usual coffee shop. He'd been consistent about our monthly meetings, showing up on time and staying focused on conversations that respected my boundaries while still building towards something that felt like an actual relationship. This particular request came with an explanation. He wanted to talk about something specific, and he thought a more private setting would be appropriate. We met at a small park near his apartment, sitting at a picnic table under trees that were just beginning to change color. Dad had brought coffee in a thermos and 2 cups, a gesture that felt both thoughtful and nervous. He poured carefully, hands that were steadier than they'd been 6 months earlier, but still showed the tremor he developed since the stress of the legal proceedings. "I've been thinking about making some changes," he said without preamble. "Real changes, not just the stuff I had to do for probation." I waited for him to continue, recognizing the tone of someone who'd been planning a conversation for weeks. "I want to move," he said. "Somewhere smaller, simpler. Maybe up north where my sister lives. Get away from all the people and places that remind me of the choices I made." The idea didn't surprise me. Dad had been struggling with the social isolation that came with his conviction, the way former friends had distanced themselves once the legal troubles became public. The neighborhood that had once felt comfortable now carried constant reminders of his association with Frank and the garage's illegal activities. "I think that sounds like a good idea," I said. "But before I do that, I want to make sure we're solid. You and me. I want to know that moving away isn't going to end whatever we've been building here." This was the conversation I'd been expecting for months, the one where we addressed the longer-term implications of our careful reconciliation. Dad had been working hard to prove he could maintain consistent, respectful contact, but he'd also been dealing with the practical realities of rebuilding his life as a convicted felon in a community where everyone knew his business. "I don't think distance has to end anything," I said. "We've been doing pretty well with scheduled contact and clear boundaries. That can work regardless of geography." He nodded, but I could see there was more he wanted to say. Dad had always been better at practical conversations than emotional ones, and this clearly fell into territory that made him uncomfortable. "I know I can't undo the damage," he said finally. "I know I can't take back the things I said or didn't say, or the way I let other people talk about you. But I want you to know that I understand now. What I lost by not knowing who you really are. What we all lost. The acknowledgement meant more than I'd expected. For months, I'd been working with my counselor on accepting that some relationships might never recover from the kind of fundamental misunderstanding that had defined my family dynamics. Hearing Dad articulate his own recognition of what had been lost felt like a foundation we could actually build on. I appreciate that, I said. And I want you to know that I understand why the situation developed the way it did. I made choices about what to share and what to keep private. Those choices protected some things, but they also created problems. You were doing your job, Dad said. I should have trusted that you knew what you were doing, even when I didn't understand it. We talked for another hour about practical arrangements for staying in touch if he moved, about the kinds of visits that might be possible given my work schedule, about how to maintain the progress we'd made without the structure of regular local meetings. By the end of the conversation, we'd established a framework that felt sustainable and honest: regular phone calls, occasional visits when my leave schedule allowed, and continued respect for the boundaries that had made our reconciliation possible. 3 months later, Dad moved to a small town outside Albany where his sister owned a bookstore and needed help with the business side of operations. The transition went smoothly, and our phone conversations actually improved without the pressure of face-to-face meetings in locations that carried complicated history for both of us. Danny had made tentative contact after Dad's move, reaching out with questions about how to maintain family connections across distance and changed circumstances. His situation in Phoenix was working out well. He'd been promoted to a supervisory role and was seeing someone seriously for the first time since his divorce. The geographic separation seemed to have given him space to process the family changes without feeling pressured to take immediate positions about reconciliation or ongoing relationships. I keep thinking about what I said in court, he told me during one phone call. About you being just a waitress. About not understanding why you wouldn't help. You were working with incomplete information, I said. But I was also being an ass. Even if you had been just a waitress, you still had the right to make your own choices about what you were comfortable with. That conversation had led to others, tentative but increasingly honest exchanges about how family dynamics had worked in the past and how they might work differently in the future. Danny was learning to ask questions instead of making assumptions, and I was learning to share information I could share instead of defaulting to complete silence about my work life. Lisa had been the most consistent in maintaining contact, calling every few weeks with updates about her daughter and questions about my life that showed genuine interest rather than obligation. She'd learned to navigate conversations that acknowledged my career without pushing for details I couldn't provide, and I'd learned to appreciate her efforts to include me in family news without expecting constant availability or immediate responses. The most significant change had been internal: the way I thought about my own identity and the relationship between my professional and personal lives. Working with the counselor had helped me understand that compartmentalization could be protective without being isolating, that I could maintain operational security while still allowing people to know enough about me to build real relationships. I'd started dating someone from outside the military community, a teacher who understood that some aspects of my work couldn't be discussed, but didn't interpret that limitation as rejection or disinterest. The relationship was progressing slowly, built on shared interests and compatible personalities rather than the assumption that complete transparency was required for meaningful connection. At work, I'd been selected for a leadership role that would involve more training responsibilities and less direct operational deployment. The position represented recognition of my experience and capabilities, but it also offered better work-life balance and fewer extended absences that required complex explanations to civilian contacts. The promotion ceremony was small and professional, attended by colleagues who understood the significance of the advancement within our community. Afterward, I called Dad to share the news: in general terms, a job promotion that meant increased responsibility and better career prospects. "I'm proud of you," he said, and for the first time, the words didn't feel complicated or conditional. That evening, I sat in my apartment and thought about the difference between the person my family had thought I was a year earlier and the person they were learning to know now. The gap between those two versions hadn't disappeared. There were still aspects of my work and my capabilities that they would never fully understand. But the relationship was built on honesty within appropriate limits rather than assumptions that served no one's interests. The woman who had sat in that courtroom and listened to her family dismiss her as just a waitress felt like someone I'd known a long time ago. Not because I'd changed fundamentally, but because the people around me had learned to see what had always been there. The uniform, the rank, the specialized training, those were just external markers of something that had existed long before they'd had words for it. What had changed was their willingness to look for it, and my willingness to let them see as much as I could safely share. 2 years after the trial, I was standing in my apartment kitchen making coffee when my phone rang with a call from an unknown Virginia number. I answered expecting a work-related call, but the voice on the other end was unfamiliar, a young woman who sounded nervous and apologetic. "Is this Captain Johnson? I'm sorry to bother you, but I got your number from your father. My name is Sarah Calderon." The last name stopped me cold. Frank Calderon's daughter, calling me from what I assumed was her college in Virginia. I hadn't thought about Frank's family since the trial, hadn't considered that his conviction might have ripple effects for people who hadn't been involved in his illegal activities. "What can I do for you, Sarah?" "I'm writing my senior thesis about the impact of white-collar crime on families, and I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to be interviewed. My professor said I should talk to people who were affected by my father's case, and your dad gave me your contact information." The request was unexpected, and I needed a moment to process it. Sarah would have been in high school when her father was convicted, old enough to understand what was happening, but probably not old enough to fully grasp the implications. Now she was in college, studying something that directly related to her own family's experience, and she wanted to talk to the person whose testimony had helped convict her father. "I'm not sure what I could tell you that would be helpful for academic research," I said. "I'm not looking for details about the case," she said quickly. "I'm more interested in how families navigate relationships when legal issues create conflict between loyalty and honesty. My advisor said your situation was unusual because you chose legal obligations over family pressure, and she thought your perspective might be valuable." That was a more sophisticated analysis than I'd expected from a college senior, and it suggested she'd been thinking about these issues with some depth. I agreed to meet with her the following week, curious about what questions she might ask and how she'd processed her father's conviction. We met at a coffee shop near her campus, and I was struck immediately by how much she resembled Frank, the same confident posture, the same direct eye contact, but without the underlying aggression that had made him so difficult to be around. She was professional and well-prepared, with thoughtful questions that showed she'd researched both the legal aspects of the case and the broader literature on family loyalty conflicts. "I've read the court transcripts," she said after we'd ordered coffee. "I understand that your family expected you to provide an alibi that would have been false. Can you talk about how you made the decision to testify truthfully instead?" I explained the basic framework, professional obligations, legal requirements, the impossibility of maintaining security clearance while committing perjury in federal court. But Sarah's follow-up questions pushed deeper, toward the emotional and relational aspects of the choice. "Did you consider the possibility that telling the truth would permanently damage your relationships with your family?" "I considered it," I said. "But I also considered what kind of relationship could only survive if I violated my professional ethics and legal obligations. That didn't seem like a relationship worth preserving." She took notes carefully, occasionally asking for clarification on points that weren't clear. When she asked about the aftermath, how my family had responded to learning about my actual career, how we'd navigated rebuilding trust, one could see her making connections to her own family's experience. "My father never talked about what happened," she said. "He just kept insisting that he'd been treated unfairly, that people he'd trusted had betrayed him. It was only when I started researching this topic that I began to understand how his own choices had created the situation." The conversation lasted 2 hours, and by the end of it, I understood that Sarah was working through her own complex feelings about loyalty, truth, and family responsibility. Her thesis wasn't just academic research, it was her way of making sense of a family crisis that had shaped her late adolescence and early adulthood. "Can I ask you something that's not for the thesis?" she said as we were preparing to leave. "Sure. Do you think my father understood what he was asking people to do when he wanted them to lie for him? Do you think he really believed that family loyalty should override legal obligations?" It was a difficult question, and I took time to consider it carefully. Frank had been many things: manipulative, self-serving, dismissive of people he considered beneath him, but I wasn't sure he'd been deliberately malicious in his expectations about family support. "I think your father believed that the rules that applied to other people shouldn't apply to him," I said finally. "And I think he believed that people who cared about him should share that belief." Whether he understood what he was asking for, or just didn't care, I couldn't say. Sarah nodded like this confirmed something she'd suspected. "Thank you for being honest about that. Most people just tell me he was a bad person and leave it at that." 3 months later, Sarah sent me a copy of her completed thesis. It was thoughtful and well-researched, examining case studies of families who'd navigated similar conflicts between loyalty and legal obligations. My interview had been one of several, but reading her analysis helped me understand my own experience in a broader context. Her conclusion was that families who successfully rebuilt after these kinds of crises were those that could separate love from enablement, that could maintain emotional connections while respecting individual autonomy and legal responsibilities. Families that couldn't make those distinctions often remained fractured long after the immediate crisis had passed. The thesis arrived during a week when I was dealing with my own family developments. Lisa had been offered a position at a children's hospital in Seattle, a significant career advancement that would move her and her daughter across the country. She'd called to discuss the decision, wanting to talk through how the move might affect our rebuilt relationship. "I don't want to lose the progress we've made," she said. "But this is too good an opportunity to pass up." I assured her that geography didn't have to determine the quality of our relationship, that we'd learned to maintain connection through intentional communication rather than proximity. The conversation reminded me of how much had changed since the trial. We now talked about decisions openly, considered each other's perspectives, and made choices based on mutual respect rather than assumed obligation. Dad's move to Albany had been successful, and he'd begun dating someone he'd met through his sister's bookstore. Their relationship was developing slowly, built on shared interests and compatible life stages rather than the flashy dynamics that had characterized his friendship with Frank. He seemed more settled, more content with a quieter life that didn't require constant validation through expensive possessions or risky ventures. Danny had gotten engaged to his girlfriend in Phoenix and was planning a small wedding that would include family members who could attend. The guest list was smaller than what would have been expected before the family upheaval, but the people on it were there because they wanted to be, not because obligation required their presence. Reading Sarah's thesis, I realized that my family had become one of her success stories: people who'd found a way to maintain love while respecting boundaries, who'd learned to separate loyalty from enablement. It hadn't been easy or quick, and it required ongoing attention to maintain, but it was more honest and ultimately more sustainable than what had existed before. The person I'd been 2 years earlier, sitting in a courtroom and listening to family members dismiss me as just a waitress, felt like someone from a different lifetime. Not because the external circumstances of my life had changed dramatically, but because the people around me had learned to see what had always been there. And I'd learned that being seen accurately was worth whatever temporary discomfort the revelation might cause. Justice, I'd learned, didn't always arrive with dramatic flourishes or satisfying reversals. Sometimes it was as quiet as a courtroom going silent when people realized they'd misjudged someone. Sometimes it was as simple as building relationships based on truth instead of convenient assumptions. Sometimes it was just the steady accumulation of days when you didn't have to pretend to be less than you were in order to keep the peace. 5 years after the trial, I was sitting in a restaurant in Seattle, watching my niece Megan blow out the candles on her 10th birthday cake, while Lisa took photos with the kind of focused intensity that mothers reserve for milestone moments. The celebration was small, just the three of us, plus Lisa's boyfriend Marcus, who'd driven down from Vancouver for the occasion, but it felt complete in a way that our larger family gatherings never had. Megan had grown into a confident, curious kid who asked direct questions and expected honest answers. When she'd learned about my military service, she'd wanted to know everything I could tell her about ships and training and what it was like to work with a team where everyone had to be excellent at their jobs. I'd been able to answer most of her questions without getting into classified territory, and her enthusiasm reminded me why I'd chosen this career in the first place. Aunt Cassandra, she said, using her fork to capture the last of her birthday cake frosting. Mom says you used to pretend to be just a waitress, so your job could stay secret. I didn't pretend, I said. I actually was a waitress, part of the time. I just didn't talk about my other job. But why didn't you tell us about the cool job? It was the kind of question that cut straight to the heart of complicated adult decisions, asked with the clarity that kids bring to situations that adults have made unnecessarily complex. Lisa looked at me with the expression of someone who'd wondered the same thing, but hadn't known how to ask. Some jobs have rules about what you can talk about, I said. And sometimes it's easier to let people think simple things about you than to explain complicated things you can't really discuss. Megan considered this seriously, the way she approached most new information. But didn't that make you sad? When people thought you weren't as smart as you really are? The question hit deeper than I'd expected. Had it made me sad? At the time, I'd thought I was being practical, professional, appropriately discreet. Looking back, I could see that I'd also been protecting myself from the vulnerability of being fully known, of having to maintain relationships that required ongoing explanation and trust. Sometimes I admitted. But I thought it was worth it to keep different parts of my life separate. I think I would have told, Megan said with the confidence of someone who'd never had to navigate the gap between personal relationships and professional obligations. I would have wanted people to know the real me. After dinner, Lisa and I walked along the waterfront while Marcus took Megan to an arcade she'd been wanting to try. Seattle had been good for Lisa. The job at the Children's Hospital had challenged her professionally, and the city had given her space to build a life that wasn't defined by family history or childhood dynamics. She's right, you know, Lisa said as we watched ferries crossing Elliott Bay. About telling people the real you. I think we all missed out on knowing who you actually were for a lot of years. I missed out too, I said. On being known. On having relationships that were built on the whole picture instead of just the parts one thought were safe to share. We talked about how the family had evolved since the trial, how distance and changed circumstances had allowed everyone to develop into versions of themselves that weren't constrained by old patterns. Dad was thriving in Albany, content with his work at the bookstore and his relationship with Eleanor, a retired teacher who appreciated his dry humor and didn't need him to be anything other than who he was. Danny's marriage was solid, built on mutual support and shared goals rather than the kind of dramatic intensity that had characterized his earlier relationships. The biggest change had been in my own approach to personal relationships. I'd learned to be more forthcoming about my work within appropriate limits, to share enough about my life that people could understand who I was without requiring access to classified information. The balance wasn't always easy to maintain, but it was possible, and it had resulted in connections that felt more authentic and sustainable. My relationship with James, the teacher I'd been dating for 3 years, had progressed to the point where we were discussing marriage and long-term plans. He understood that some aspects of my career would always remain private, but he also knew enough about my values, my capabilities, and my commitment to service to build genuine respect and partnership. When he met my family, they were able to see me through his eyes as someone accomplished and complex and worthy of admiration, which had helped heal some of the wounds left by years of casual dismissal. The phone call came 2 days after Megan's birthday, while I was back home in Virginia preparing for a training rotation that would take me to California for 6 weeks. Dad's voice was tight with controlled emotion, the tone he used when he was trying to stay calm about something serious. Frank Calderon died in prison, he said without preamble. Heart attack, apparently. His daughter called to let me know. I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair, surprised by the complexity of my reaction. Frank had been the catalyst for everything that had changed my family, the person whose influence had created the crisis that eventually led to truth and reconstruction. His death felt like the end of a chapter I'd thought was already closed. How are you feeling about it? I asked. Relieved, mostly, Dad said, and his honesty surprised me. He wasn't a good influence on my life, and knowing he's gone makes it easier to believe that part of my past is really over. We talked for a few minutes about the practical implications. There would be no early release, no possibility of Frank returning to the community and trying to reconnect with old associates. Dad's probation had ended 2 years earlier, but the psychological freedom of knowing that chapter was permanently closed was significant. Sarah Calderon called me directly later that week, her voice steady but sad. She'd graduated the previous year and was working as a victims advocate in Richmond, applying her thesis research to help families navigate the aftermath of criminal justice proceedings. "I wanted to thank you again," she said, "for the interview, but also for what you did during the trial. I understand now that testifying truthfully wasn't just about legal obligations. It was about refusing to enable behavior that was hurting people." "I'm sorry for your loss," I said, because regardless of what Frank had done, he'd been her father, and grief was complicated even when it involved imperfect people. "Thank you. I'm sad, but I'm also relieved that he won't hurt anyone else." "That probably sounds terrible." "It sounds honest," I said. "And honesty isn't always comfortable." That conversation stayed with me as I prepared for my training rotation, as I thought about the long journey from the person who'd sat in a courtroom 5 years earlier to the person I was now. The external circumstances of my life hadn't changed dramatically. I still served in the same capacity, still maintained the same professional obligations, still lived in the same general area. But the quality of my relationships had transformed completely, built now on truth within appropriate limits rather than assumptions that served no one's interests. The woman my family had dismissed as just a waitress had been real, but incomplete. The captain who'd stood up in court to testify had also been real, but isolated. The person I was now felt more integrated, more whole, more capable of maintaining both professional excellence and personal connections that mattered. It had taken years to find that balance, and it required ongoing attention to maintain, but it was worth every difficult conversation and awkward boundary-setting session that had made it possible. Justice, I'd learned, wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was as quiet as a family learning to see each other clearly. Sometimes it was as simple as refusing to be smaller than you were to make other people comfortable. Sometimes it was just the accumulated weight of days when you didn't have to choose between being honest and being loved, because the people around you had finally learned that the two weren't mutually exclusive. Thanks for watching. If this hit home, tap like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a backbone today. Questions for you? Have you ever been asked to lie for family? What did you do? Where did you draw the line, and what changed after? What's one boundary you wish you'd set sooner? When people underestimate your job, do you correct them or let it roll? Drop your answers in the comments, and if you're setting new boundaries this year, type boundaries so we've got your back.